Is it strange how quiet an airfield sounds when the flag rope clicks against an empty pole? Len Carver was mocked for wanting to keep the bomb craters, said progress shouldn't wear scars, but when the cement trucks came, he dropped a tin of soil from one crater into the pour, and the hum of engines rose as sunlight flashed off the wet runway. Still, that plaque at the edge reads, "Built from what broke us," and every flight since has lifted on his silence. The Kansas sky looked like brushed aluminum, pale and cold, the kind of morning that made sound carry. Wind slipped through the hangar doors of an airfield long since abandoned. A faded poster, Veterans Day 1947, still clung to the corrugated tin, its corners curling like burnt paper. A car door creaked. Reporter Jack Avery stepped out, camera slung around his neck, shoes crunching over gravel and frost. The runway stretched ahead of him, cratered and uneven, as if the earth itself had flinched and never recovered. He raised a hand to shield his eyes. A figure stood halfway down the broken tarmac, gray coveralls, cap, low hands in pockets. Jack hesitated, then started walking. The man didn't turn until Jack was 10 feet away. His name, stitched above the breast pocket, read, L. Carver. The lines in his face looked cut by the same tools that had torn the runway. "Morning," Jack said, keeping his voice low, respectful. "You used to work here?" Len nodded once. "Used to keep the birds flying. Now I keep the ghosts company." Jack smiled faintly. "Looks like the war never left." Len studied the crater beside them. "These holes, they're the marks that kept us honest." He crouched, ran a calloused hand along the jagged rim where grass fought through cinders. "They remind you how easy it is to forget what you stood on." The reporter leaned closer, noting the neat way Len's fingertips traced the edge like a mechanic inspecting a familiar engine. "They say they're going to rebuild this place," Jack offered. "Turn it into a commercial field." Len let out a slow breath. "Sure. Fill the scars. Paint new lines. Call it progress." Wind swept across the plain, tugging at their coats. For a moment the air carried the faint smell of oil and rain, the scent of engines that hadn't run in years. Len reached down, scooped a handful of soil, and let it fall into a small tin box he pulled from his pocket. The sound of the grains against metal was soft, final. He closed the lid carefully, as if sealing away a confession. "What's that for?" Jack asked. "Insurance," Len said, "in case they forget what they're building on." They stood in silence. Somewhere far off, a flag cable clinked against an empty pole. The echo drifted across the field like the last note of a hymn. Jack adjusted his camera but didn't raise it. "You mind if I write about you?" Len shook his head. "Write about the ground instead." "I just happened to be standing here." A thin smile crossed the reporter's face. "People forget the ground faster than the stories." Len turned toward the horizon where the runway vanished into glare. "Then maybe you should start with this." He tapped the crater's edge with the toe of his boot. "They're building a new war on top of the last one." The wind answered, carrying his words down the empty strip until they faded into the sound of nothing. The town hall smelled of coffee, gone cold, and damp paper. Ceiling fans turned lazily, scattering the hum of argument across wooden benches. Outside, rain whispered against the windows, soft but insistent. At the front of the room, the council table looked like a battlefield of its own, maps, folders, and half-empty cups standing guard. "Gentlemen," the chairman said, tapping his pencil, "the question remains, do we fund a school or do we repair this so-called runway?" A murmur rippled through the room. Len Carver stood near the back, hat in hand. His coveralls were still streaked with dust from the airfield. When they called his name, he walked forward without hurry boots, thudding once with each step. He laid a roll of paper on the table. Mud flaked off its edges as he unrolled it, old blueprints stained with ash. Lines of runways and crew quarters spread like veins across pale skin. One councilman frowned. "Is this supposed to convince us? We can't fly on sentiment, Mr. Carver." Len didn't answer right away. He touched one burned corner where a faint mark read, "Crew Quarters C." The paper trembled slightly under his fingers. "That," he said softly, "is where we learn to listen to orders, to whine to each other." The rest was noise. Laughter broke somewhere in the back. "With respect, sir," another voice said, "we need progress. The past doesn't pay taxes." Len nodded slowly. Progress built on forgetting usually costs more. The chairman sighed. Mr. Carver, this isn't about disrespect. It's about use. That land's sitting idle. He looked up at them, eyes steady. Idle land still holding something. For a heartbeat, the room went still. Only the clock ticked deliberate as a metronome. Dust drifted in a shaft of light from the high window, settling across the papers like quiet snow. Jack, the reporter from the field, leaned against the doorway taking notes. His pencil paused mid-stroke as though the air itself had grown heavy. "May I?" Jack asked gently, stepping forward. "If you pave that place without remembering what's beneath it, you're not building a runway, you're burying a record." The chairman's eyes narrowed. "This meeting is for residents, not journalists. I'm here," as both Jack said. "My brother's name is on that wall outside." Len rolled the blueprint closed. The sound was slow, deliberate, like the turning of a page no one wanted to end. He tied it with frayed string, nodded once toward the table. "Then I've said my part. Mr. Carver? We haven't voted yet." He lifted the tube under his arm. "You already have." Len walked toward the door. Behind him, the clock ticked twice before anyone spoke again. He stepped into the rain hat brim, low blueprint pressed tight to his chest. Water darkened the paper's stains until it looked whole again. Mud turned to ink. He folded the plans before they could vote. The moon hung low over the Kansas plain, pale as chalk. The crater field stretched for acres, shallow bowls rimmed with frost, each one catching the silver light like a mirror turned to the sky. The air was brittle. Each breath rose white before vanishing. Len Carver trudged ahead, a stake bag slung over his shoulder boots, crunching over frozen mud. Behind him came Tommy Hart, the youngest pilot from the training corps, 20th a day, his scarf trailing in the wind. They had no lantern tower, no work light, just a single flashlight and a borrowed compass. Every 20 paces, Len stopped and drove another stake into the earth. The dull thud echoed through the stillness. Tommy squinted toward the next depression. "Feels like we're walking on ghosts." Len adjusted his cap. "No kid," he said, voice calm on foundations. The younger man nodded, not sure whether to smile or bow his head. He marked another line with chalk, careful as if drawing a blessing. For a long while they worked without speaking, the only sound the steady rhythm of hammer and breath. Each crater they crossed seemed smaller, less like a wound and more like a socket waiting for purpose. When they reached the largest one, Len stopped. The flashlight trembled in his handbeam, tracing the far rim. Frost glittered like glass. "Here," he said. "This one's got depth enough for truth." Tommy bent to check the compass reading. "True east by 10 degrees. Len gave a short nod. "Then that's our start line." He crouched, drew a finger through the thin crust of ice, marking the path where the new runway would lie, through the very heart of what once had been ruin. The gesture was simple, reverent. "You really think they'll approve it?" Tommy asked. "The council, I mean." "They don't need to approve what's already right," Len said. "We just have to prove it can hold." The flashlight sputtered, flickered once, then died. Darkness fell quick and total. For a moment, neither moved. Only their breathing filled the night. Somewhere far off, a train horn drifted through the cold, low and mournful, like a memory remembering itself. Tommy cleared his throat. "Guess that's it for light." Len smiled in the dark. "Then we'll use what's left." He reached into his pocket and brought out the tin box. The lid clicked open, faint but clear. He scooped a pinch of the soil, sprinkled it where the first stake stood. "This ground's already seen worse," he murmured. "She won't mind another scar if it means someone can land safe." Tommy watched, silent. A breeze brushed past them, stirring loose frost into little spirals of silver. Len straightened, dusting his hands. "Tomorrow they'll call this progress. Tonight it's just remembering how to build again." They gathered their gear. The cold crept higher, biting their fingertips, but neither complained. As they walked back toward the truck, the stakes behind them caught the moonlight thin glints, marking a line that ran straight through history. It looked for a fleeting second like a runway already waiting. At dawn, the airfield shook with the low growl of engines. Cement trucks lined the edge of the crater field, their drums turning slow and heavy. Mist drifted above the frozen soil like steam escaping from memory. Len Carver stood by the biggest crater coat buttoned high tin box in his palm. The men waiting with shovels glanced toward him for a cue. They all knew who he was, even if the foreman hadn't said his name aloud. Jack the reporter crouched near the tripod, notebook open. "You sure about this?" Lin nodded, eyes on the churn of the first mixer. "They'll pour whether I'm sure or not. Might as well give the ground something to keep." He knelt beside the rim and flipped the lid. Inside, the soil looked darker now, almost alive. A faint wind swept past, stirring the fine dust until it shimmered in the new light. He whispered, "All right then," and tipped the tin into the wet earth. The soil scattered down the slope, disappearing into the gray. The foreman signaled. Valves hissed. The cement began to flow thick, relentless, the color of morning ash. It splashed into the crater and spread outward, swallowing the marks of the past inch by inch. For a moment the sound was deafening. Jack turned away, camera shaking. The workers leaned on their shovels, watching the mix rise like a slow tide. Len stayed still. The drumbeat of machinery pressed through his boots, through his ribs, until it felt like the world itself was pushing down. The weight of progress pressing memory flat. He thought of the boys who once dug these holes, young faces lit by the flare of a torch, not gunfire. Now their work was being buried again, but this time maybe it would hold. "Hold that edge," the foreman shouted. "Keep it level." The men adjusted their boards, shouting back against the roar. Concrete frothed and settled. The smell of lime filled the air. Jack raised the camera again, then lowered it halfway. "It looks like water," he said quietly. Lynn didn't move. "Then maybe it'll reflect something worth keeping." Sunlight broke over the horizon, caught the wet cement, and turned the surface to glass. The reflection shimmered sky faces, ghosts, then hardened to gray. The machines slowed. One by one the workers fell silent, hats off, without being told. The rumble faded until all that remained was the hiss of cooling metal and the far rattle of a distant truck. Len stepped forward, boots sinking half an inch into damp gravel. He rested a hand on the edge of the new slab. "You feel that?" he said. Jack nodded, voice small. "Feels solid." Len looked past him down the stretch of fresh concrete. "She's holding her breath." The reporter frowned. "Who the ground?" Len said. Finally holding its breath. He straightened slowly, watching the last sheen of water dry under the growing light. In that moment the crater was gone. No wound, no hollow, just a surface ready for flight. Behind them, the trucks idled, waiting for orders. The foreman barked something about curing time, but no one moved. For one breath everyone stood quiet, as if afraid to disturb what had just been made. Then the sun climbed higher, catching on a rivet, a helmet, a tin box half buried in gravel. The air shimmered again, and Len turned away, wiping dust from his hands. The ground finally held its breath. The morning came bright and still, the kind of light that makes everything look newly painted. The air smelled faintly of tar and metal, and a thin haze hung above the runway like breath. Families filled the stands, farmers, widows, and children with paper flags too large for their hands. The brass band tuned at the edge of the tarmac, notes wobbling and sweet. Planes stood in perfect line across the concrete engines, idling slow propellers, glinting like coins in sunlight. Jack Avery moved through the crowd with his camera notebook folded in his jacket pocket. He spotted Len Carver near the far end of the strip, goggles pushed to his forehead, his coveralls clean for once. Len looked small against the expanse of new cement. The place that once looked like ruin now shimmered with purpose. The mayor stepped up to the wooden podium. Microphones popped. His voice carried across the field. "Today we open a runway built from what broke us." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The mayor held up a folded sheet of paper, glanced at the old mechanic standing apart. "We stand on what was scarred, and because of that we stand steady." He turned toward Len. "That handful of soil you kept, we built on it." The sound of propellers deepened, a low hum like applause. Len's lips moved, but no sound came. His hand brushed the tin box in his pocket. Jack clicked a photo shutter, loud in the quiet. Len finally spoke, just loud enough for the mayor and a few nearby workers to hear. "Only in Kansas," he said, voice thick but steady, "could a hole turn into a runway." The mayor smiled. "And only because men like you knew what the ground could bear." A gust rose from the idling planes, scattering dust into the air. It spun and glittered around them, settling over shoulders and hats like confetti no one had planned. Children laughed, reaching out to catch it. Wives wiped their eyes. Old servicemen stood with hands over hearts. Jack lowered his camera. "That's your legacy, Len. Not the holes, the way you filled them." Len chuckled softly. "I didn't fill them, just showed folks they were worth keeping." They stood side by side, watching the mayor shake hands with the pilots lined up for the first flight. The air carried the sharp scent of aviation fuel and the faint sweetness of cornfields beyond the fence. A band struck up "America the Beautiful." The crowd joined, voices rising thin and wavering in the wind. Len took a half-step back, letting others move forward for the photographs. He found a patch of shade beside a hangar and slipped into it quietly, the way a man returns to his place after a long song. From there he could see everything. The runway gleaming white, the brass plaque set at its head, the people smiling through tears. He took off his goggles and wiped the fog from inside them. Jack caught his eye from across the tarmac and raised a hand in silent salute. Len returned it with a nod. Somewhere a propeller revved higher. The band faltered, then caught the tune again. The dust rose once more, swirling gold in the sun. Len smiled as the first plane began to roll its shadow, gliding smooth over the place where the deepest crater once lay. He whispered to himself, a prayer or a promise, it was hard to tell which. Then he stepped farther into the shade, letting the sound of engines carry the words away. The year had turned and time had pressed the edges of the airfield smooth. Grass grew between the seams of the old concrete, and a row of silver training planes now rested where the bomb craters once had been. The sky over Kansas was the same, wide, pale, and endlessly patient. Tommy Hart, older, now hair touched with gray at the temples, led a line of cadets down Runway 2. The young men carried notebooks and the restless energy of people who hadn't yet learned what silence could mean. "Keep your eyes on the line," he said, his voice firm but kind. "The marks tell you more than the instruments do." One cadet jogged ahead, grinning. "Sir, is it true this strip used to be a crater field?" Tommy smiled. "Used to be a whole patchwork of them, some deep enough to lose a jeep." The boy whistled low. "And they built this out of that—" "Not out of it," Tommy corrected gently, slowing to a stop. "On top of it." He pointed toward the far end of the runway where a brass plate glimmered half buried in the concrete. The cadets gathered around. Dust had dulled the engraving, but the words were still clear. "Built from what broke us." One of the boys knelt, tracing the letters with a fingertip. "Who put this here?" Tommy glanced up at the horizon where the hangar roof shimmered in the sun. "A mechanic named Len Carver," he said. "He saw what was left and figured out how to make it hold." The group stood silent for a moment. A wind rolled across the field, carrying the distant hum of an engine. "He was a quiet one," Tommy added. "Didn't like speeches. Said the ground already remembered enough words." A cadet shaded his eyes. "Sir, was he here when they poured it?" Tommy nodded once. "He was the one who dropped the first handful of soil." The sound reached them, then a single-engine trainer climbing into the blue. The plane's shadow rippled along the concrete, tracing faint lines where the old crater rims had been. The boys watched, heads tilted back. "That shadow," Tommy said softly, "used to fall into holes. Now it just keeps going." He looked down the length of Runway 2, the reflection of sunlight off metal flashing like signals in code. "The next war would be yours," he said almost to himself. "But it won't be in the mud. It'll be up there where the sky remembers what the ground once held." No one spoke. The hum of the plane deepened, then faded into the horizon. Tommy turned back to the brass plate. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the shine, just the faintest ripple, like a face nodding in approval. He blinked, and it was gone. He drew a slow breath. "All right, cadets. Back to the hangar." The group shuffled off, murmuring boots tapping against the cement. When the last of them had gone, Tommy lingered by the plaque. He rested his hand against the warm metal, the same way he remembered Len resting his hand on wet concrete so many years ago. The wind picked up again, rolling down the runway like a steady breath. Tommy looked skyward. The next trainer had already taken off its silver wings, banking over the field. The sun caught its underbelly, turning it white against the blue. The radio in his pocket crackled a hiss of static, then a clipped voice calling, "Tower check." He smiled, not answering right away. As the plane rose higher, its shadow slipped perfectly along the path of the old crater lines. Narration overlay, quiet as a thought carried on air. The next war would be theirs in the air, not the mud. From scars to sky. The sound dissolved into soft radio static. Tommy lowered his cap voice barely above the wind. He spoke once and the world kept flying.